Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today we're going to look at a chart called the Histomap of Religion, which was created back in 1943 by a man named John B. Sparks, who was a chemical engineer who made charts as a hobby. This one was actually part of a series of 3 charts that he made, all of which were called histomaps, and all of which were published by Rand McNally. From a design point of view, I think they're pretty great because of how the changing column widths give the viewer a sense of how things change over time. Now, if you're familiar with any of these charts, it's probably this one, which was simply called the Histomap and was subtitled 4,000 Years of World History, Relative Power of Contemporary States, Nations, and Empires. This was the first one that Sparks created and was the one that sold the best, originally for just $1. But he also later designed 2 lesser-known histomaps, the Histomap of Evolution and the Histomap of Religion. I'm going to focus on the religion one, since, as I mentioned last time, I'm hoping to publish my own chart of world religions sometime this year. But first, I want to show you how you can chart out your own history, thanks to today's sponsor, MyHeritage. I've talked about MyHeritage many times on this channel, but I've never actually shown you the step-by-step process of creating a family tree and just how easy this is. So I'm going to do that now. You'll start with a screen like this, where you'll be asked to enter your name and your parents' names. Then when you click Go, you'll be asked to enter as much as you can about your mother's mother and your mother's father, and then your father's mother and father's father. After that, MyHeritage does the rest. In just a few seconds, it found a match between my grandmother and a record that looks to be the same person. The name, birth year, death year, and husband are all the same. So all I have to do is click Yes. The match is then confirmed, and the system automatically gives me 50 extra people that I can add to my tree. All I have to do is click Add to Tree, and voila, I'm suddenly well on my way to building my tree. As time goes on, MyHeritage will continue to give me more and more matches by comparing the people on my tree with other sources, including the almost 20 billion records that MyHeritage gives me access to. So if you'd like to build your own family tree, you can sign up for a 14-day free trial of MyHeritage right now by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. As a Useful Charts viewer, you will also get 50% off their premium membership. Okay, back to the Histomap of Religion. Unlike the original Histomap, this one starts at 180,000 years ago, and thus a good portion of the chart, I'd say about 1/3, is focused on prehistory, which is everything that happened before written records. For most of the prehistory section, there are 6 columns, each representing a type of early religion. But it's important to note that these types do not correspond to specific regions of the world. In most cases, each type developed in more than one place, and in each place, more than one type developed. Now, while this chart is 80 years old, and based on theories about the origins of religion, which have now been either rejected or at least seriously revised, the general ideas expressed by these 6 types are still somewhat valid, so let's take a look at them one by one. The first column is magic and fetishism. You've probably heard the word fetish before, but in a very different context. Here, it simply means an object that has special powers. So the idea is that early humans started to use objects to perform magic, to ward off evil, or to put curses on their enemies. Now, I'm pretty sure that Sparks would have been familiar with this set of books, called The Golden Bough, which were very popular in the early 20th century, and still remain influential today. In them, the author, Sir James George Frazer, argues that all religions started with magic, but then evolved to other forms, which were more advanced. This is why, later in this section, Sparks writes, primitive peoples in Africa, Australia, India, etc., lacking necessity or incentive for further cultural evolution, carry on this animistic fetishism in their tribal rituals to this day. So this is not something that current scholars of religion would ever say. It's representative of the very Eurocentric, holier-than-thou attitude that was still common at the time. Nowadays, scholars still see differences between the types of religious practices out there, but they no longer put them on a continuum from primitive to advanced. Which makes sense because magic and fetishism can still be found in just about every culture. For example, Jews and Muslims often still hang a hamsa or wear an eye bead for protection. And many Christians still have a lucky piece of clothing that they wear, say when playing sports. Okay, the next column is taboo and totemism, a pairing that is probably based on this book by Sigmund Freud. You've likely heard of totem poles. Well, a totem is simply an emblem, often an animal, that is used to represent a certain family or clan. A taboo is something that is forbidden, or at least severely frowned upon within a human culture. One of the taboos that virtually all human societies have, for very good reason, is a taboo against incest. So the idea is that totems helped to prevent incest by creating a system whereby people had to marry someone with a different totem. Now, I'm not sure how accurate that theory is, but what I do know is that, once again, totems are not something that can be relegated to so-called primitive cultures. I mean, don't coat of arms basically serve the same purpose? And what about team logos? They certainly divide people into tribes, and folks can get pretty darn religious about their favorite sports teams. All right, we now come to ancestor worship. And this one probably represents the oldest type of religion because it relates to burial practices, which go back at least 100,000 years. We now know that even Neanderthals buried their dead with certain rituals. The idea expressed here is that people often see their dead relatives in dreams, and that this led to the belief in mana, which is a Polynesian word for life force, but also to concepts such as ghosts, spirits, and souls, which in turn led to the belief in some sort of underworld or afterlife. So in order to prepare the dead for the underworld and to prevent them from coming back to bother the living, humans started to bury their dead with certain rituals in order to show respect, and with certain grave goods that they might need. The fourth column talks about tribal gods and divine kings. This one I don't think deserves to be placed back this far on the chart. The idea of divine kings really didn't evolve until after agriculture and permanent settlements, which was around 12,000 years ago. That's when human society started to become divided into different classes. So I'm going to skip this one for now. Which brings us to nature worship, or as it says here, propitiation of nature spirits. Propitiation simply meaning trying to win favor. If we zoom out, you can see that this particular column and its successors ends up growing to dominate most of the chart. That's because to this day, it's still one of the main theories that is floated around when it comes to the origin of religion. Basically, the theory is that at some point, humans extended the idea of spirits to animals, trees, and plants, and even inanimate things such as the sun and moon, a concept known as animism. This then led to the worship of nature because obviously the spirits of nature were more powerful than the spirits of humans and needed to be appeased. This is kind of the opposite of magic, which posits that humans are the powerful ones and can use sorcery to impact the world. This is summed up right at the top of the chart by this line here, which indicates that magic is about the relationship between subhuman and human, whereas nature worship is about the relationship between human and superhuman. But remember, this chart is over 80 years old and is based on theories which have now been heavily revised. Nowadays, instead of saying that magic is primitive and nature worship is more advanced, scholars of religion would now simply say that the two things are just different, and in fact often go hand in hand. Now, there's one more column, and it's labeled fertility cults. These were matriarchal and presumably developed because women can give birth while men can't. But it's important to keep in mind that most of the information we have about mother worship in prehistoric times is simply guesswork, based on objects such as Venus figurines. Let's now shift our attention towards the Neolithic period and Bronze Age. The first region-specific religion to show up on the chart is Egyptian religion. Sumerian religion, which later influenced Mesopotamian religion, showed up around the same time, but for some reason was not shown. Egyptian religion is a good example of how the 6 general types of religion, shown at the top, often get combined. Some of their gods may have originated as totems, which is why many have animal heads. But then eventually, nature-related gods, such as the sun and wind god Amun-Ra, took precedence. But Egyptians also incorporated a belief in divine kings, and lots of practices related to death and burial. They also used magic and had a universal mother god. So, as you can see, their religion was a mix of all 6 original types. However, this chart places them under the nature column, which is fair because, in the end, everything was connected somehow to the Nile River's flood cycle. The next region-specific religion to show up on the chart is Aryan religion, which nowadays we call Indo-European religion. This one's important because this is where the general notion held in the West that God is some sort of old man in the sky comes from. The early Indo-Europeans had a god called Dios Petar, which simply means sky father. But as the group spread to different areas, he became the Greek god Zeus, the Roman god Jupiter, and the Germanic god Tu, from whence comes the word Tuesday. But most importantly, the name was the basis for the Latin word Deus, which then became Dieu in French, Dio in Italian, and Dios in Spanish. But the Indo-Europeans also migrated into India. There, as I mentioned last week, Indo-European religion likely combined with elements from Indus Valley Civilization religion, of which, unfortunately, we know very little about because their script remains undeciphered, but also with other local religions. This synthesis developed into Hinduism, but also gave rise to the Shramana movements, which include Buddhism and Jainism. However, it's important to note that Indo-European religion also spread to Iran, where it eventually evolved into the mostly monotheistic Zoroastrianism. I say mostly monotheistic because while it has just one supreme being called Ahura Mazda, it also has an opposing evil being called Angra Mainyu. But now that we've reached Zoroastrianism, I have to bring up the term the axial age, which doesn't actually appear on this chart. If we zoom out to look at the entire chart, you'll notice that the busiest part of the chart is right in the middle. This is where a bunch of new religions start, thus splitting the chart into 2 parts, the old religions before it and the new religions after it. And if we zoom back in, we'll find that the most dense part of the chart is right here between 1000 BCE and the start of the Common Era. This period consists of the Late Iron Age and early Classical Antiquity. But scholars of religion call it the axial age because it serves as sort of an axis that caused the world to turn. The fascinating thing about the axial age is that religious change occurred in many different places, pretty much simultaneously, but as far as we know, also independently from one another. So around the same time, we get Lao Tse and Confucius in China, Isaiah and Jeremiah in Judea, Socrates and Plato in Greece, Zoroaster in Persia, and the Buddha in India. I won't say much about Taoism and Confucianism because, quite honestly, Chinese religions aren't my specialty. I'll just note that this chart has them coming out of ancestor worship. But I will, of course, say a bit about Judaism. I like that the chart shows Judaism as starting after the Babylonian captivity, because this is indeed accurate. Prior to this, the religion of the Hebrews is best referred to as ancient Israelite religion, because it was quite a bit different. Here, it shows Israelite religion as mostly coming from ancient Egyptian religion, which from an academic point of view is pretty accurate, although I'd add that Mesopotamian religion played a major role as well. Notice, though, that the chart mentions Moses adopting the Kenite god YHWH. Now, while Moses is understood these days to be more of a legendary character, the connection to the Kenites is actually still a real possibility. The Kenites lived approximately here and were perhaps somehow related to the Midianites and or the Shasu, who also lived in this general area. This inscription, found in Egypt and dating to before the emergence of Israel, mentions the land of the Shasu of YHWA, which has led some scholars to posit that perhaps the Israelite god YHWH was inherited from the Shasu. But regardless of how this god came to become the main Israelite god, what we do know for sure is that the Judahites were worshipping him, and only him, by the time of the captivity. However, Judaism was far from a static religion at this point. It continued to be influenced by outside forces, including Greek philosophy and Zoroastrianism, which is why, in my opinion, the Jewish scriptures are so important, regardless of whether you believe or don't believe in the Abrahamic God. I think a lot of it boils down to geography. The Jews happened to live at the crossroads of 3 continents. They were therefore influenced by almost every major ancient power, from Egypt and Mesopotamia to Greece and Persia. Thus, the Jewish scriptures are kind of an amalgamation of many ancient ideas. One of the things that my friend Syawish and I like to debate is whether monotheism was invented by the Jews or whether they took the idea from the Zoroastrians. My opinion is that while Zoroastrianism likely helped cement Jewish monotheism, Zoroastrianism was a little more dualistic. Like I mentioned earlier, it has an evil spirit called Angra Mainyu. He was incorporated into Second Temple Judaism as this guy, but from there he was passed on to Christianity and Islam while being dropped by Rabbinical Judaism. Let's now take a look at how the chart deals with Christianity. Note that Jesus is not given any more special attention than anyone else, which is nice because it makes the chart unbiased, at least in this regard. It also quite rightly shows Christianity as coming out of Judaism, but also being heavily influenced by Greek and Roman ideas. But check this out. The end of the orange Egyptian religion section ends up looking like an arrow with the word Horus in it, pointing to Jesus. Sparks might have done this on purpose because there are indeed some similarities between the Horus story and the Jesus story, most notable the fact that they both involve resurrection. However, I would like to point out that many of the similarities between Jesus and other dying gods often get overblown. Currently, the overwhelming consensus among all historians, both religious and secular, is that Jesus was in fact a historical person, born in Judea, not just some myth made up by copying other religions. Of course, Christianity is eventually shown splitting into Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. It's a bit unfair that the Catholics are shown as keeping the original color, purple, because really each branch has an equal claim to being the original trunk of the tree. If we go down even further, we of course find Protestant Christianity branching off from Catholicism. But before I point out a few things along the bottom, I want to go back up and talk about Islam. On this chart, Islam is shown as branching off Judaism and is placed in a manner so that Judaism ends up in the middle of the 3 Abrahamic religions. In my opinion, it would be more accurate to put Islam in the middle. As I've explained in previous videos, Islam was probably influenced by an early Christian sect that viewed Jesus as the Messiah, born of a virgin, but not as the divine Son of God, which is also how Jesus is viewed in Islam today. So in many ways, Islam is sort of a mix between Judaism and Christianity, which is why I think it deserves to be placed in between the two. I now want to move from the green column on the left of Christianity, Islam, to the green column on its right, which is the continuation of Greek philosophy. Eventually, it gets labeled humanism and consists mostly of Western European philosophers. But then around 1850, we get a new pink column branching off. You can probably guess by the name Marx here that this new column represents communism, which is somewhat strangely included as a religion. I mean, one could argue that communism can be kind of like a religion, but then capitalism should be included as a religion as well. You see, this is where this chart gets really biased, which is a shame because up to now, the chart has been fairly non-judgmental, aside from the slight against so-called primitive people that I pointed out earlier. I mean, Sparks makes it super clear that he doesn't like communism. He calls it a corrupt philosophy and mentions godless propaganda. He then states communism reveals itself to be a police state aimed at world domination. He also has a separate column over here that also mentions communism and ends up being called state worship. Not sure why he didn't put the two together somehow, but he did make them both pink. Perhaps he wanted to bring to mind the term pinko? If so, that's a second example of a subtle message found on this chart. Okay, so now that we've looked in depth at the Histomap of religion, I do want to say just a few things about the other two histomaps. First, the original Histomap. Again, from a design perspective, it's pretty great. However, from a teaching perspective, it is not. Just like the Adams Synchronological chart of history that I discussed in a previous video, the information is out of date and very much skewed toward a 19th century European perspective. If we look here at the bottom, we can see that 90% of the chart focuses exclusively on Europe. India, Mongolia, and China are given a little bit of attention throughout, but there is zero mention anywhere of sub-Saharan Africa or the pre-Columbian Americas. The Histomap of evolution is even worse when it comes to its 19th century views. The first half is fine, but once humans show up, things get pretty twisted. It incorporates a lot of now debunked racial theories, in which the African race is quite clearly posited as being inferior. Not only does the chart use outdated terms, it also places the Africans right next to monkeys and apes, unfortunately even using the same color, so that by the bottom of the chart, they merge. So while these charts can be used to teach students how 19th century Europeans saw the world, the actual content on the chart should not be used as a teaching tool. Now, last time I talked about old charts like these, I got a few comments saying it's unfair for me to tell people not to use certain charts, considering that I myself sell charts about world history. Well, let me respond by saying that I would never make a video complaining about a competing product made by a contemporary designer. But the Histomap is 92 years old, and the Adams one is 153 years old. To me, that's fair game. In fact, as a history educator, I feel that it's my duty to inform people about the differences between these older charts and more up-to-date products. And when it comes to more up-to-date charts, I'm happy to point people to others beyond just my own. One that I highly recommend, especially for younger students, is the Big History Timeline Wallbook by What on Earth Publishing. The format is quite similar to the Adams chart and the Histomap, but it's way more up-to-date and comprehensive. While researching for this video, I also discovered that someone has created a Histomap of Africa and is selling it on Etsy. So shout out to them for creating some of the content that's missing from the original Histomap. Now, one last thing before I go. If you'd like to take a closer look at any of the 3 Histomaps by John B. Sparks, know that all of them are available for free as digital downloads. This is because they are all so old that the copyright on them has expired. Some sites will try to sell you digital copies, but they're just downloading the free ones and then slapping a price tag on them. So watch out for that. One really good resource when it comes to downloading vintage charts for free is the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection. I'll leave a link to that in the description, as well as direct links to all 3 Histomaps. Okay, so that was a look at the Histomap of religion. Let me know in the comments if there are any other charts that you know of, particularly old ones, that you'd like me to review. Thanks for watching.